Hey, so it's been a bit of a bit, uh, other stuff going on, but let us resume the journey of the hobbits and Neptius and all things going on and rumblings in Remarden. Soon the serfs were able to dexterously move themselves to dodge and block any incoming strikes. Yarvich had created a successful ragtag team of human serfs ready to strike at the heart of their problems in Ovlachk. He kept up the rhetoric of bringing everyone together and being equal and fair, of how Manrift had cheated his way to the top of everyone with his wealth and tricky hobbit ways. He played on the stereotypes of halflings, how there must be some good reasons that the dwarves don't like them, so the humans shouldn't either. Wherever halflings went, it always seemed like pain followed it. Manreft was a prime example, since when he visited Ovlachk and left, there would be people who were sick for days at least. There was a reason why none of the serfs there had known any other halflings besides Manreft. They were obviously too good to step so low that they would visit the village where the common folk made the food that sustained Remarden. Those hobbits probably thought the food came from some invisible cabbage patch in the sky, considering how little dignity they paid to the serfs. Yarvich made sure to instill these messages in each and every one of the serfs under his watchful eye. The words and convincing to go after Jandarin was much easier to do, since everyone in the village had a bone to pick with that Gersog who ruled over them so harshly. The serfs were ready and eager to hate their overlord. They fought to take him down in their training sessions. Meanwhile, whenever Yarvich was not plotting the downfall of his various enemies, he spent his time in the simple way that any serf would. He grew the cabbages to feed himself and the village, and eventually the kingdom itself. He was acutely aware of this fact. He seemed to have it in his mind that the people of Remarden relied on him and his work. When he wasn't growing his cabbages, then he'd be at the tavern arguing with the serfs there, or arm wrestling them to win a bet or two. He did not press his luck when betting, as he was a somewhat conservative man when it came to taking risks. This new venture against the order in the village was done in a way that best suited his personality. Yarvich took great pains to plan every little detail out that might hinder such a gregarious act. He wanted to get out of this alive, and he knew that the first eminent prince would recognize the rightful takedown of an unjust tyrant. Yarvich was fine if they sent in another dwarf to replace Jandarin, as long as he was fair, and spread the wealth equally throughout their tiny holding. If that did not work, then the elves from Hleb had given him their solemn vow to fight if that time came. Being a serf, Yarvich did not know how to read or write, but he trusted his local priest of Vodari to not tell anyone about his plans. The priest was often friendly to everyone around him. Yarvich had grown up to believe in the water goddess's presence in the world. Yarvich would often get anonymous writers bearing a sealed letter from Bronin, the elven leader, and then take them to be read by the priest because the writer did not know letters either. The letters often contained words of encouragement for the young leader of the serf movement. No real details about the plan of attack were contained therein, but it was enough for the priest to understand that something dangerous was going on. He did not want anyone to get harmed in the village, so he would often not tell the whole truth to Yarvich. Still, what was told was enough to relay that the people of Hleb were rooting for his success, and wanted the best for his tiny fraction in Remarden. And, if necessary, they would send people to back him up. Then the day finally arrived when all of Yarvich's plans were to come to fruition. The parties that night in celebration of the wedding had gone on extra long. He declared it was time to strike against the evildoers in their village. Each serf in turn struggled against the ideas that they might have to kill their own neighbors, but still, this was quieted in their minds, justified by the tiniest slights that might have been done to them and overlooked. The serfs were ready to attack after they had all gathered in the forest to retrieve their weapons. Each person among them was armed with either spear, axe, or pike. They had been trained and ready to use the instruments to deadly precision. After meeting in the woods, they broke off into their various groups of 3s or 4s and headed to where the merriment was going on. For the most part, the serfs enjoying the celebrations had collapsed or stumbled back to their huts with satisfied smiles on their faces and hands clutching their bellies as they threw up. The conspirators crept up to the tent from all sides, trying to make as little noise as possible. They succeeded in doing so, and on the third crow's caw, charged into the tent. The serfs burst in from all sides, with spears thrusting, axes swinging, and pikes jabbing. At the beginning of the melee, no one expected such a catastrophe to happen. Yarvich himself led the charge in attacking the nearest guard, thrusting through his bowels to have that man fall on his recently eaten meal. There was complete uproar and chaos in the tent as serf fought and killed other serfs. The clanging of steel on wood resounded. More and more Reitzars seemed to appear. However, and soon the tide swiftly turned against the favor of these equalizing serfs. Yarvich spotted Manreft holding a frying pan flanked by another hobbit, guarding Jandarin. He quickly swirled and dodged the mace of one heavily clad Reitzar in front of him. He bent to avoid the swing, which was promptly trying to make its way towards his head, like a lusty lover going after a long-awaited kiss. He dodged it barely, and just as another was coming down vertically towards him, he deftly moved to the side and plunged his spear into the armored man's guts. Clearly the Reitzars were not expecting to meet such fierce resistance from the serfs as they were facing. None of them expected these farm boys to be able to go blow for blow in their attacks. The serfs seeking revenge cut down people they knew, as well as the people of Jandarin and Manreft. The blood rage had taken a hold of them. They could not differentiate between their once friends and foes. In their eyes, everyone in that tent was guilty of some tiny slight to their honor, or major one, and therefore deserved to be met with a bloody end. Most of the serfs were going about executing the frightened villagers who were cowering or fleeing in order to save their lives. But while these serfs were filled with bloodlust, they almost forgot about the Reitzars there, who they were really supposed to go after. Yarvich managed to get a break after that last dwarf he slew, and took a deep breath as he looked around the tent. Jandarin was surrounded by serfs on all sides, as they crept in trying to get a sufficient enough blow to take him out. Otherwise, serfs were falling left and right of him. There were way more Reitzars there than he could have guessed from his posturing into how many people would be sober and able to fight. The Reitzars were too sober. Something had gone wrong with his plan. But he didn't care. All that was in his mind was to take out that damned halfling who had caused all of his misery in the first place. Yarvich could hear women screaming and running about the tent. He could specifically hear Mika's beautiful voice raised up in anguish at all of the violence and chaos around her. She looked gorgeous still, even though she was surrounded by these atrocities. Yarvich had a brief glimpse into the tragedy that had befallen her, but this was quickly ripped away by his hatred for Manreft. He still saw the halflings off towards Jandarin, facing down the angry mob of serfs. A smile slowly crept over Yarvich's face in such a gruesome fashion, since it was covered by blood and practically dripping from sweat. Yarvich saw what was happening, and enjoyed it immensely. Finally, the serfs would take vengeance upon their oppressors. He would be able to save Mika from a terrible life of what would most likely be ridicule and hatred. He had no idea why she would even consider marrying a halfling when he was always there for her. Yarvich would figure it out after he had dealt with Manreft. He had no time to seriously go in depth about the reasons before, though it had always nagged at him like an angry mother waiting for him to plant the cabbages. Yarvich advanced towards the group, ready to pounce upon the hapless trio situated in the middle. He moved languidly, taking his time and enjoying the fear in their eyes, as they must have known their days of shoving their wealth in other people's faces were soon to be over. Yarvich moved closer and closer, ignoring all signs of battle around him. He did not care that the noises grew louder in his ears. The hum and thrill of blood grew in his brain to create a dull, aching pain. Yarvich was about to enter the circle surrounding the overwhelmed defenders when, all of a sudden, everything went black. Wrightstar reinforcements had dealt with most of the attacking serfs, and had finally gotten to help Jandarin. One Wrightstar stood triumphantly over a dead serf he had just struck over the head with a deft crunch on his skull, with the mace gripped in one hand. This serf had been strange. The Wrightstar had noticed that he wasn't paying any attention to the battle raging on around him in the tent, and he wore on himself a pleased smile as he advanced towards the Gersag of Ovlachk. It was a good thing, too, since the serf had no idea that this Wrightstar was creeping up to him to strike this killing blow. Yarvich died instantly from that mace. One by one, the serfs fell. Most were clustered in small groups now. There was no mercy for them. The Wrightsars struck and killed as many as they could at that time. Jandarin, Manreft, and Hans were saved from the victorious group of serfs surrounding them by more guards and Wrightsars coming to their rescue. The fighting seemed to die down as more serfs started to throw their weapons and surrender. They got on their knees and started to blubber and plead for mercy from the authorities who had beaten them back, and finally vanquished them. Jandarin was badly hurt, with a cut on his leg troubling him immensely. But before he could seek medical help or healing from any Herbician, he had to see justice dispensed to these damned savages who had interrupted such happy goings-on. The innocent village folk were gathering themselves up. They were finding their dead. Many women among them were crying over the slain bodies of their husbands who had been a part of the conspirators. Other women were rushing about to find their children, and, luckily, they could not find anyone inside the tent where the slaughter had occurred. Instead, they simply mourned over their dead friends and family. Everyone knew each other in Ovlachk, so it was a harsh blow to this tiny village. They had never seen anything of this magnitude before. Tears streamed down the faces of men and women alike, some crying so hard they stopped for breathing for seconds on end because of the endless sobs that tore out of their throats. Manreft ran to Micah. He clutched her close in his arms. She saw the devastation that was caused by these evil serfs and could not even begin to comprehend it all. Her mouth uttered a silent prayer to Vodaria, in the hopes that the goddess would guide them down the stream of endless happiness, where they would meet their ancestors in utter bliss. Nothing could compare with the loss these people had just endured. Even Manreft, who had come across raided convoys by brigands, had never felt the hurt that was in his heart now. Hans ran to check whether or not his crew was doing well, or at least as well as they could be doing in such a situation as this. The halflings had not yet realized that they had personally killed people. Neither of them had thought it possible for them to strike at a fellow being and find the life forces draining out of them. Hans found that his crew was all good, considering the circumstances. They had not witnessed as much killing as they had before today, but they handled themselves decently in the fight. The mere presence of so many different-looking races had quickly turned the attentions of the murderous serfs, but when confronted by a real lizardman, They tended to look away in fear and chose the easier targets. Jandarin was supported by another dwarf Reitzar as he made his way towards the, now surrounded and disarmed, group of angry serfs. They were not as angry as before, but some still held defiance in their eyes. He did not have the time nor the energy to declare anything as of right now, so he just approached them, limping, and said in a stern voice, "Throw them into the dungeon, and do whatever you want with them, till I make up my mind on how to end these wretched cretins' lives. Take me back to the castle, boys. It's been one hell of a night." And with that, Jandarin left, leaving the mess of dealing with the aftermath of this battle up to his Reitzars and the village folk. The Reitzars took the gathered group of criminals up the hill and down into the depths of the castle, all while hitting them and hurling insults at them. The guards were going to have a fun time with this bunch that they hadn't had in a long time. The other serfs were still in the tents, crying and grieving over the carnage that had been brought to this once pleasant occasion. Hans gathered his crew together and hugged goodbye to his uncle Manreft and his new aunt Mika. They were crying silently together, embracing one another when he came to say his goodbyes. A terrible loss had occurred here to everyone involved. Hans didn't want to be the one who got blamed for it. The serfs' attentions might now be on their dead, but eventually, he knew, it would turn into hatred and more violence towards halflings. A couple of days after the incident, Jandarin was up and about again with the help of his personal steward to walk. He descended into the dungeons where the prisoners had not been treated to any food nor water. The dwarf Gersog of Ovlach trundled down the stairs into the bleak underdark that encased his prisons. The serf prisoners were all held in a cage. About 5 of them had survived. A shame, he thought. The less, the better. Jandarin knew there was only one way to deal with these criminals. He had them all brought in front of the tavern in the village where the elves from Hleb had first appeared, and he ordered the construction of a major gallows built to house them all. The carpenters in the village were delighted at this newfound work. It paid well, being from the Gersog himself. The wood that flowed down the Ulaga made for the perfect instruments to be crafted into this death-dealing device. A great birch gallows was built just for this occasion, and probably for many more to come. Jandarin was helped up onto it, and the prisoners were escorted there, their hands tied behind their backs and prodded on by the Reitzars. There was nothing they could do to escape their self-made fate. One by one, the nooses were slung over the hapless serfs' necks, ready for them to drop. Jandarin at this point deigned to look upon these wretched creatures that were once known to belong to him. "My serfs, we gather on a terrible, dreadful day today. These fellows were part of a group who tried to kill me. Kill us! How many of you have lost family members and friends to these horrible people? They attacked during one of the most joyous occasions our village has seen in a very long time. They broke the sacred decency that all people, humans, dwarves, halflings, that anyone has. Who in their right minds would do such a terrible thing? There's only one fitting punishment for this heinous act." He lifted his arm and dropped it. The floors dropped out under the criminals. Suddenly, all those flew down with a satisfying crack that reverberated throughout the still air. At first, the atmosphere was that like a carnival, with villagers happy to be gathered together to see justice served in an appropriate manner. There were serfs gathered by the sides of the public yard, which was located in the middle of the village, who sold rusted nuts and all manner of food made out of cabbages or various edible treats wrapped in cabbage. These vendors made a tidy little profit for that day. Not many public executions were held in the small village of Ovlachk, so the few that were the exception brought out almost everyone. This fact, coupled together with the sad matters of the attack, and so many people involved, brought forth almost everyone in the vicinity. All manner of people and races were to be seen there on that day. It was quite a sight to behold. To the lowly serfs of that village, who had really known only humans their entire lives, the vendors made a sizable profit on the influx of so many new faces, and later became wealthy in Ovlachk. With the breaking of the necks of the transgressors and attackers on the town, there was quite a stir. At first the air was silent, as the entire crowd held their collective breath in anticipation for the final end to these miserable fellows' lives. Finally, with the crack, people let out the words of hatred and spewed on the evildoers all manners of insults. They took turns spitting on their corpses. Women held up their children to show just exactly what happened if they misbehaved. Enterprising youth broke all manner of things off of the dead serfs, toes, fingers, garments, and some even held each other up to pry out teeth from the corpses. Of course, Jandarin had seen enough by this time. He ordered his Reichstars to intervene and push back the crowd. They held the line against people who were clawing and trying to shove each other in order to reach the slain bodies on the stage. Though Jandarin had no love for humans, and even less for these dangerous serfs, who thought they could make everyone equal, he still had a fear and respect for the dead in his heart. He knew what sorts of evil could spring out of corpses which were not treated well. He had seen things which he did not care to think about during the war. Things that seemed otherworldly. And besides, Jandarin was raised to be a good and gracious dwarf in the spirits of Groganus. This, in turn, with his own experiences, made sure that even these criminals' bodies were given the proper funerary rites. Manref stayed in the village to help Jandarin sort everything out. The halfling saw it as his duty to remain and calm everyone there, as well as help Mika mourn over the loss of her friends. Though luckily, none of her parents were killed in the action. Jandarin recovered from his leg injury in a few months, but walked with a limp for the rest of his life. A Gersog of such importance as him on the border between the two kingdoms of Ramarkia and Ramorden was quickly visited by the first eminent Prince Kolovab again. It was a great honor for Jandarin to receive such a high guest at his castle, and everything was celebrated accordingly. Manreft and Mika moved to a little cabin outside of Ostanovka, the capital, and there they had many cute children mixed of halfling and human blood. Being a bit outside of any civilized society, they had the freedom enough to do almost anything they wanted, and to live a peaceful life within their own family. It was after this tragic incident that in Ovlachk that the renowned halfling chef, Hans Ardebart, found himself in utter disgust of all things human. He returned to the capital of Ostanovka, and quickly either fired or demoted his human staff members. Luckily, he had not been working long with anyone there, so the now demure hobbit had no qualms about getting rid of them. He quickly looked to the more underrepresented races of Ramarden, hiring almost solely lizardmen, halflings, and even an orc. Hans noticed a shift in his customers almost immediately. A lot of them stopped showing up. The regular clientele that moved in to get food at his tavern every day started to dry up. Sure, he still had the wealthy, very secretive clients order his food and receive the chef at their private estates, but the common folk seemed not to care for his new staff or ways of cooking. Hans was in this downward phase of his career when he had to cut back. He was forced to go to the market on his own for the food he cooked. He had been able to save up a tidy fortune when things had been in the heat of being good, Plus, his uncle Manruft had a good head for knowing just where to place money in order for it to make profit without doing much. He knew just what spices and types of cloth to buy, and had the right connections to make it all wind up working for them. Hans had taken a week where he brought his several halfling children to play amongst the market stalls, as he was still in his main element, where the majority of the village's poorer folk cooked and ate. The halfling hoped that his trip out to Atrodnaya would pay well. He was banking on the quality of coal that he had heard so much about. Hans wanted to add some sort of extra flavoring to his meals. He always enjoyed these times where he could simply walk around the vendors, trying to find the best deals amongst the people selling their goods. His children, for the most part, ran amok amongst the various different crowds and people that made up the crowd. Hans always had faith that his children would return at the end of the day, and so he was a father who respected them, and would defend them, to the death even, if it meant that. The halfling heard an incredible commotion as he was wandering through the various different stalls in the market of Atrodnaya. An exceedingly unusual scene was playing out. A dwarf, with a fiery orange beard, one which significantly reminded him of the fires of his oven, had tripped over some halflings, and started to lob insults against them. It took a second for him to realize that these were, in fact, his very own children. Quickly, Hans ran into the middle of the scene, pushing aside humans and lizardmen and all folk to get in. The dwarf had fallen over one of his children again, and so Hans quickly gave him a good glob of spit from the back of his throat in order to show the dwarf that he shouldn't be messing with his children. However, the dwarf proved more agile than he had expected. Hans found himself on the ground receiving utterly painful kicks to his shins. He could feel his head swooning under the blows, and almost distantly he heard the crunches made by the dwarf's shoes in his shins. Hans proceeded to pass out under the pain in Atrodnaya. And that concludes that chapter. Next time we'll move on to part 3, Elves, in my book, Rumblings in Remarden, which you can pick up in the link in the description, or check out the sequel to it, Deviations of Defiance. And I have new short stories coming up at the end of this month, hopefully, called The Kingdom Swell. Thanks again. Hope you like, share, and subscribe, of course. And have a good one.